My multicultural monster is going to be Grendel from Beowulf. So, in order to talk about Grendel, we first have to discuss where Beowulf came from and the context surrounding it. So, Beowulf is written in what is now modern day Denmark or Scandinavia, and only one copy of the manuscript exists. This was a point in history before the printing press was even invented, and so the poem had to be told and retold mostly through oral tradition, which is why, depending on which version of the text you read, you'll get slight variations of the wording, but the story is still the same. So keep that in mind. Beowulf was written during a key point in history where the Anglo-Saxons were shifting from a pagan perspective into a Christian perspective under this idea called syncretism. And syncretism was this process of taking religious aspects from one aspect of culture and weaving them into another aspect of culture in order to get a certain population to convert. In this case, it would be the conversion from the Anglo-Saxons to go from a polytheistic point of view, believing in the Norse gods, to believing in just one single god. Okay, but what happens in the actual story itself? Well, let me break it down for you. Okay. So we have this king, this Danish king. His name is Hrothgar, and he rules over this mead hall, which is named Herod. And the men and people of Herod are being terrorized by this freakishly ugly monster named Grendel for 12 years. And the Danish people can do nothing about it. Their swords don't work. Their men constantly fall and die and get eaten alive by this monster. And the Danish king Hrothgar is desperate for help. So desperate, in fact, that he asks a very young warrior in Gietslin, which is modern day Sweden, for help. And this warrior happens to be named Beowulf. And so Beowulf and 14 of his mightiest men sail out to the Danish kingdom in order to assist Hrothgar. Well, what does Grendel actually look like? Well, that's a good question because it's actually pretty vague. So if you read the poem, there is no clear-cut definition of what Grendel looks like, but we do have some clues. We know for a fact that he has talons and razor-sharp claws. We see that during the actual fight between Beowulf and Grendel. But another thing to point out is his magical attributes, mainly his skin. It's believed that his skin was magically fortified because the Danish people tried to kill them with their swords, but the swords literally bounced right off of him. And so it's implied that Grendel has this magical barrier that protects him from the Danish people. And so no mere mortal man nor sword can touch Grendel. Um, we need someone supernatural, someone with the strength of 30 men, if you will, someone like Beowulf. It's nighttime at Hera, and Grendel seizes this opportunity to attack the meat hall since everyone is asleep. Um, so Grendel goes in for the kill, beheading people and eating them and ripping off limbs. Obviously, this wakes up Beowulf, and so it's down to him versus Grendel, like straight in the middle of this meat hall. And Beowulf, with the strength of 30 men, literally rips Grendel's arm right out of his socket, which is pretty gnarly if you ask me. This doesn't kill Grendel, but it does wound him severely. And he retreats back to his meter, which is his pool. At this point of the story, Grendel isn't dead. He does die later, but we're not going to talk about that point in the story. So I want you to keep that in mind. So remember what I said about his physical appearance, that there is no clear-cut definition of what it looks like. We do have some pretty common interpretation. So what you see here on the top is more akin to what a typical monster would look like, right? Because you have like the red monster's eyes, and you have the razor sharp claws that Beowulf has to encounter during his fight with him. And then you have like the monster's kind of hoof-like feet, very inhuman. This is very typical of what a quote unquote ordinary monster will look like. But then you have this interpretation down here, which is from the 2007 CGI Beowulf movie. And this guy right here has more human characteristics. Like look at his slack jaw and like the humanoid eyes. I'm not gonna play the actual clips of the movie here, but if you watch the fight in that movie, Grendel almost seems to be in pain, and in a weird, twisted kind of way, you feel some kind of sympathy towards it because it's just in so much anguish, even though it's like ripping and beheading all of these people. So the top demon typical monster idea. Bottom, sympathetic, pitiful, humanoid abomination perspective. So we talked about Jeffrey Cohen and his ideas about monsters over and over and over again this semester. By now, we should have all of his theories memorized, but for the sake of this context, I'm going to go with thesis 2 and 3, even though I can frankly make a case that Grendel fits all 7 of his theses. But I'm going with 2 and 3, um, mostly because for thesis 2, the monster always escapes. Pretty obvious. The first example, when Beowulf rips his arm off, he goes back to was his lake and hides. And even before Beowulf shows up, he would always terrorize Hrothgar's men as much as he liked, and then retreat back to wherever he was. And it's interesting because nobody could really stop him to this point, because, as I said before, um, Grendel is a supernatural monster. No mere ordinary sword or man could kill him. And so it's like, why would he stop if Beowulf wasn't around to put him in his place? We also have thesis 3, the monster is a harbinger for category crisis. He is absolutely hard to classify because, as I've said earlier, Grendel does not have any clear-cut definition of what he looks like. We don't know whether he's a demon or an ogre or something supernatural. That is up to scholarly debate. And to me, this adds to the appeal of Grendel because it's more or less up to the imagination of the reader to imagine what Grendel looks like, which is why you have all of these different depictions of the monster. Some are ogre-like, some are demon-like. It could be like in the 2007 movie where he's more human-like and really like pitiful and pathetic. And because of all of these differing clashing characteristics, it helps explain his hybrid of monstrous features. Plus his debate about whether he's a natural or a supernatural monster. Again, think about his magic skin and how swords literally bounce off of it. So it's up in the air whether he is from this earth or not. Okay. So remember what I said about syncretism and the idea about taking Christian elements and weaving them into pagan ideas? Well, this is actually really relevant to that because you find out that Grendel is actually a descendant of Cain. Yes, that Cain, the Cain where he murders Abel in the Bible. Grendel is actually a descendant of him. Even though Cain himself isn't actually in the poem, it's explicitly stated that that Grendel does come from Cain. And so we could say that Grendel himself is a very important syncretic element in Beowulf. And the point is actually emphasized when Grendel is literally described as being cursed by God, which we're going to see in a second. Okay, so this point in the poem is the very first time that we actually see Grendel enter the mead hall. The English translation is going to be on the left-hand side, but I'm going to read the right-hand side. The calm of more yondom isliothom Grendel gongen, gore zeribar. Monte seman skade monachune, sumne bisiran, and the la tham hayan. Voron of roklam to tayes the hevu resid, gosele gumena ieros wesid. And so by describing Grendel as this kind of bane of the race of men, Grendel serves as a physical link between pagan and Christian ideas. And like I said before, Cain himself doesn't make an appearance in the story, but it's still inferred that Grendel's exile from God mirrors Cain's own exile from God. Beowulf is very, very, very old, 8th century. This was a point where religious ideas were seeping into our horrific monsters, and we see this theme kind of evolve and change and morph under contemporary stories. The Exorcist being a great example of that. Blatty's The Exorcist is a religious horror story, but these two ideas differ, which we're going to see in the next slide. So the idea of Christian elements are used in very different ways, comparing these two. On the right-hand side, Beowulf serves to convert us into Christianity. Like Grendel coming from Cain being a very obvious example. We're trying to go from polytheism to monotheism. That's the whole point of Grendel being descended from Cain. The Exorcist, meanwhile, doesn't really serve to do that. It mainly uses Christianity as an outlet for religious horror. So the idea of a lack of faith from Karis or having no faith at all, like Chris McNeil, is what drives the horror elements from The Exorcist. Another really interesting point that I want to bring up about Grendel is that he is a creature from the lake. We have seen this trope kind of take many different forms and evolve over different points in time of literature. So not only is Grendel and his mother a creature from the Mir, or a lake in English terms, we also see this in contemporary horror examples, such as Jason. Jason Voorhees is a very sinister monster from the lake, in this case, the Camp Crystal Lake. Um, and so this idea of monsters coming from like large bodies of water harkens back all the way back to Beowulf and Grendel. So I want you to keep that in mind. And yeah, thank you all for watching. Have a good day.